Spring of 1958. Ava Gardner is sitting in her Beverly Hills home, holding a newspaper. On the front page, the wreckage of a plane in New Mexico. On the second page, a photograph of Elizabeth Taylor stepping out of a funeral, black dress, eyes swollen red. And on the third page, a single sentence: Frank Sinatra was by Taylor's side. Gardner folds the newspaper, sets it on the table. Those who were there that morning would later say she never flinched, never spoke. She simply rose from her chair and stepped out onto the balcony. But inside that silence was a decision, and that decision would shape the most fascinating triangle in Hollywood history in ways no one fully understood until decades later. If you have followed this channel before, you already know that Hollywood's golden age was never just about glamour and light. It was about power, who held it, who lost it, and who was smart enough to never let anyone see them reaching for it. The story of Ava Gardner, Frank Sinatra, and Elizabeth Taylor is one of those rare stories that operates on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a love triangle. Underneath, it is something far more complicated, far more human, and far more revealing about what it actually cost to be a woman in that industry. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story that keeps you watching, subscribe now and turn on notifications. There is much more ahead. To understand what happened in 1958, you need to understand what bound these three people together long before that morning in Beverly Hills. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was not simply a studio in the 1940s and 1950s. It was an ecosystem, a closed world with its own rules, its own currency, and its own invisible hierarchies. Louis B. Mayer ran it like a feudal kingdom. Actors were not employees, they were assets. Their images were managed, their romances were sometimes manufactured, and their private lives were rarely their own. Every major star on that lot knew the others not just by reputation but by proximity, sharing makeup rooms, commissary tables, and the particular psychological pressure of existing inside a machine that needed you brilliant and cooperative at the same time. Ava Gardner had arrived at MGM in 1941, signed on the basis of a photograph rather than any demonstrated talent. She was 19 years old, from a tobacco farm in North Carolina, and she barely spoke above a whisper in her screen test. The studio saw what it needed to see: a face that the camera loved with an almost irrational devotion. Over the next several years, MGM transformed her through voice lessons, acting coaches, and a relentless grooming process, and by the mid-1940s she had become one of the studio's most valuable properties. Gardner on screen had something that could not be manufactured after the fact. She had presence, and more than that, a quality of self-possession that made every scene she was in feel slightly dangerous. Frank Sinatra came to MGM in 1944, and both of them chafed against the studio's careful packaging of their personas in the same way. They felt everything too much, and they showed it. They met on the lot, casually, in the spaces between takes, and the attraction between them was immediate and mutual and entirely complicated by the fact that Sinatra was married with 3 children. The affair became public in 1950, and the fallout was immediate. Sinatra's fanbase felt personally betrayed. His radio show lost sponsors. His record sales declined. His film career at MGM stalled. Gardner, meanwhile, was painted as the temptress who had destroyed a family, in a framing that said far more about the era's expectations of women than it did about the actual dynamics of the relationship. They married in November 1951, after Sinatra's divorce was finalized, and almost immediately the marriage became what so many people around them had predicted: a love story too intense, too combustible, and too saturated with two enormous egos to sustain itself in ordinary domestic life. He was jealous. She was unpredictable. They fought with the same passion that had drawn them together, and the separations came in waves, each one leaving both of them slightly more exhausted than before. The divorce was finalized in 1957, and yet, and this is the detail that matters more than any of the formal legal proceedings, Gardner never stopped loving him. She said so plainly in interviews throughout the rest of her life. She said it in her memoir. The marriage ended. The love did not. And this distinction is not a romantic cliché in Gardner's case. It is a psychological fact that explains almost everything about what she chose to do in 1958. At the same time all of this was unfolding, Elizabeth Taylor was living a parallel life on the same studio lot. Taylor had begun at MGM as a child and grown up there in the most literal sense. By the mid-1950s she was the studio's most luminous star, and also, beneath the public image, deeply unhappy. Her first 2 marriages had failed. Her third was deteriorating. She was searching for stability and the sense of being genuinely seen, and in 1956 she believed she had found it. Michael Todd was not a conventional Hollywood figure. He was a showman in the old-fashioned sense, extravagant and theatrical, and he had produced Around the World in 80 Days, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1956. More importantly, he adored Taylor in a way that was visible to everyone around them. He made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely protected. They married in February 1957, and by all accounts it was the happiest period of Taylor's life to that point. Frank Sinatra and Mike Todd were close friends, genuinely close, and Sinatra knew Taylor not as a romantic possibility but as the wife of one of his closest friends, which placed her in an entirely different category. She was, in the most old-fashioned sense, off-limits. On March 22, 1958, Mike Todd's private plane, named the Liz after his wife, crashed into the mountains of New Mexico. There were no survivors. Taylor was 26, recently recovered from a serious illness that had nearly killed her the previous month, and now suddenly a widow with 2 young children. The grief was total. Sinatra came. Of course he came. He was Todd's friend, and now Todd was gone, and the obligation of friendship extended naturally to the woman Todd had left behind. He was there at the funeral and in the days that followed, by every account genuinely trying to help, making sure she was not alone in the particular way that grief in that era could leave a woman alone. But Hollywood had already begun to tell a different story. The press had noticed Sinatra's visits. The gossip columns had picked up the proximity. And because the press in 1958 operated according to narrative templates it applied to every situation involving attractive people, the template that got applied was the obvious one. Romance, a new chapter, the widower and the widow, except it was the wrong way around. The arithmetic was already being done in every newspaper office in New York and Los Angeles. What no one in those newspaper offices was thinking about was Ava Gardner. Because Gardner was officially in the past. The divorce had been finalized the previous year. She had moved on, or appeared to have, and the press had moved on with her. She was now a glamorous international figure, living largely in Europe, making films in Spain and England and Italy. She was not part of this story, at least not according to the narrative taking shape in the spring of 1958. Except that she was. Because the heart does not operate according to the official narrative. Gardner, reading that newspaper in Beverly Hills, was not simply an ex-wife receiving news about her former husband. She was a woman who had never stopped loving him, watching the man she loved move toward another woman in the most publicly visible possible circumstances, in the wake of a tragedy that gave his proximity to Taylor a sanctified quality that made it almost impossible to oppose. And yet she did not oppose it. She did not make a scene. She folded the newspaper, set it on the table, and stepped onto the balcony. And that is where the real story begins. What happened in the months that followed is relatively clear in its broad outlines and genuinely murky in its finer details. Sinatra and Taylor did spend significant time together in 1958. There were reports of a relationship, reports that both denied with varying degrees of conviction. Taylor was not in an emotional condition, by most accounts, to enter a new romantic relationship. Her grief for Todd was real and consuming. Whether they were romantically involved in any meaningful sense during this period is a question the available evidence does not definitively answer, and this ambiguity is itself part of the story. What is clear is that Gardner was aware of the situation. What is clear is that she made a choice not to intervene. And what is clear is that this choice, so counterintuitive, so contrary to every narrative that would have seemed to follow naturally from the circumstances, was not passive. It was not resignation. It was something more calculated, and more dignified, and more revealing of Gardner's actual character than almost anything else she did in her public life. People who knew Gardner well in this period describe a woman who had arrived at a particular kind of clarity about herself and about Sinatra. She understood that her relationship with him had been real and deep and also fundamentally unworkable, that the same qualities that had made him irresistible to her were the qualities that had made the marriage impossible. She understood that loving someone and being able to build a life with that person are not the same thing, and that confusing the two had cost her years of her life and a considerable portion of her peace of mind. And she understood, and this is the part that rarely makes it into the romantic mythology surrounding her story, that stepping back was not the same as giving up. It was, in its own way, a form of power. There is an account from a friend who visited Gardner in Rome later that year that has never received the attention it deserves. The friend described asking Gardner directly about Sinatra and Taylor and the situation that had been generating so much press coverage. Gardner apparently laughed, not a bitter laugh but a genuine one, and said that the world was watching to see if she would behave badly, and she had decided to disappoint them. The friend asked what she meant. Gardner said that the only interesting move in a situation where everyone expects you to fight is to not fight. And then she changed the subject. Taylor's own accounts of this period, given in various interviews over the decades, are notably careful. She acknowledged Sinatra's support and was warm about him as a friend who had been present during one of the worst periods of her life. She did not, at any point on the record, describe anything that crossed from deep friendship into romance. This is, of course, exactly what she would say if there had been a romance, but it is also exactly what she would say if there had not been one, which makes her testimony less useful as evidence and more useful as a reminder of the limits of what the historical record can actually tell us about private experience. Gardner, for her part, gave several interviews in which she was asked about Taylor directly. The responses were invariably gracious. In one interview conducted in the mid-1980s, Gardner said that Taylor was one of the few women in Hollywood who had never needed anyone's permission to be exactly who she was. The interviewer asked if Gardner felt the same about herself. There was a pause, and then Gardner said, quietly, that she had needed a long time to learn it, but yes, eventually, she had figured it out. What makes the Gardner-Sinatra-Taylor triangle so much more interesting than the standard Hollywood love story is precisely what it reveals about the choices available to women in that world. Taylor's strategy was confrontation. She met every challenge to her autonomy head-on, demanded what she wanted, refused to be managed or diminished, and paid enormous social costs for that refusal while also extracting enormous professional rewards from it. Her negotiation of the $1 million contract for Cleopatra in 1963 was the most visible expression of this strategy. Taylor believed that the way to survive was to take up space. Gardner's strategy was different, and harder to see because it looked, from the outside, like passivity. It was not passivity. It was a form of strategic withdrawal, an understanding that in a world designed to use women against each other, declining to participate in that dynamic was itself a form of resistance. Gardner did not compete with Taylor for Sinatra's attention not because she had given up, but because she had made a calculation. If she fought, she lost, not necessarily in the sense of losing Sinatra, but in the more fundamental sense of becoming the villain of a story that did not deserve a villain. She would confirm every narrative the press was already constructing about her. She would diminish herself in the eyes of the only person whose judgment she actually cared about, which was her own. Frank Sinatra would marry twice more after Gardner, Mia Farrow in 1966 and Barbara Marx in 1976. He and Gardner remained in contact throughout their lives with a warmth and a complexity that neither of them ever fully explained to anyone on the outside. There were phone calls, occasional visits, and a thread of mutual understanding that even those closest to both of them found difficult to characterize. When Sinatra was hospitalized in the final years of his life, Gardner, herself in poor health in London, reportedly called. What they said to each other in those final conversations belongs to the category of things that will never be known. Sinatra died in May 1998. Gardner had preceded him by nearly a decade, dying in London in January 1990 at 67. By the accounts of those around her at the end, she was at peace. Elizabeth Taylor outlived both of them, dying in March 2011 at 79. Her life after the Todd years was its own extraordinary story, the Burton marriages, the career reinventions, and ultimately the AIDS activism that became her most lasting legacy. She and Gardner were never close in any meaningful sense, but the mutual respect between them was, by those who witnessed it, unmistakable. Two women who had survived the same system, by different means, with different costs. There are three versions of what happened in 1958, three interpretations of why Gardner chose silence, and none of them can be definitively proven. The first is that she stepped back because she was wise enough to see that the battle was unwinnable. The second is that she stepped back because she already knew something about Sinatra and Taylor that the rest of Hollywood was still speculating about, something that made the apparent competition less real than it looked from outside. And the third is the simplest, and perhaps the most devastating. That she stepped back because, after years of fighting for a love that had consumed her, she had finally learned that some things are worth more than winning. Which of those three is true is something that only Gardner knew. And Gardner, who kept her own counsel about almost everything that mattered, took the answer with her when she left. And perhaps that, in the end, was the most Hollywood ending of all.